Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and this is going to be another Q&A where I'm going to answer 10 questions from the post I made on the YouTube community page. So the first question is, for almost every sport we require more or less every quality, strength, linear speed, etc. But how to periodize what to train more, what less, and what to leave. In simple words, how to design any sport-specific training plan which will not neglect any quality. So the answer here, and we've talked about this I think on the previous Q&A, is the vertical integration approach. And that's where we train all relevant qualities for the sport that you're trying to train for simultaneously. And then the emphasis of that quality can shift over time, but we're still always training those qualities at all times. For example, let's say an athlete requires linear speed, plyometrics, power, and strength for their sport. We can always train all those qualities throughout the whole year, but the emphasis of each of those individual qualities can shift from more general to more specific based on when we need to peak. So for example, linear speed training can start with sort of shorter distances and more of an acceleration focus, and that can progress to longer distances to more of a top speed focus over time. Or power training can start with sort of heavier loads with slower velocities, then transition to more specific lighter loads with faster velocities closer to when they need to peak. And any quality that's going to be important to train for that particular sport can shift from more general to more specific over time. But all those qualities should be trained simultaneously throughout the entire year. I have some videos on periodizing training for field sports or team sports or athletes that require multiple different qualities, and also a video on the issue with typical block periodization and why vertical integration is going to be a better approach to use for those athletes. So next we actually have two questions that were quite similar. The first one is just a general, how can you increase your pull-up? And the second question is, how to progress in pull-ups / chin-ups when you're stuck at 10 to 12 clean reps. The main goal is hypertrophy and strength. Is it time to start weighted? High volume, low reps like EMOM, ladder. Thanks in advance. So I covered some tips on pull-ups in the previous Q&A, but it seems to be quite a popular topic. So I'll give you a few more tips and some things that I've done personally to help improve my pull-ups. So first and foremost, I'm not some expert in calisthenics or bodyweight movements. I simply use pull-ups as an exercise for hypertrophy. So my goal personally when I do pull-ups is not to see how much weight I can do pull-ups with or how many reps I can do pull-ups with. It is to use pull-ups as a means to grow muscle. And I think it's a great exercise for that. So what we first need to establish is your goal to actually improve how many pull-ups you can do or improve your pull-up performance, or is your goal to use pull-ups as a method for another goal like hypertrophy? If your goal is to actually improve your performance in pull-ups specifically, we need to define like what the range of motion is, what your grip is, and then we can use sort of the principles of specificity to train specifically for that exact movement that you're trying to do. For example, if you're trying to improve your pull-ups for some sort of pull-up competition or some sort of calisthenics event, you may only have to get your chin over the bar. So that means you can cut your range of motion a bit shorter and tilt your head up more so that you're making each rep the most efficient possible. However, that's not going to be the best way to go about hypertrophy training because we want to use a greater range of motion. So for this question, they've specified that the main goal is hypertrophy and strength. So I'm assuming we're going to use a full range of motion, standard chin up, and they want to improve their performance and get some hypertrophy from that movement. So some tips for pull-ups is that I don't think that using sort of special techniques like every minute on the minute or some sort of ladder or pyramid setup is going to be the best way to do it, because I think pull-ups seem to really fatigue quite quickly. So I think for pull-ups, you really need to give yourself a lot of rest in between sets. Otherwise, performance goes down really quickly. So I found that, if I don't give myself enough rest, only my first set I really perform well, and then after that, my performance drops off really quickly. So first tip is definitely give yourself as much rest as you need for every single set of pull-ups. So one of the things they asked also is it time to start weighted? And I think if you can do 10 to 12 clean reps, that's a decent amount of reps, and I definitely think you can start implementing weight, and I would recommend to start adding weight. Because if we think about it with pull-ups, if someone, for example, weighs 80 kilos and they can do 10 to 12 reps, for them to add a 10 kilo plate and do pull-ups is not that significant of an increase in load because they're already pulling 80 kilos of body weight. So a 5 or 10 kilo increase is not a huge amount, and you're still going to probably be able to get between sort of 5 and 8 reps with that weight. So I definitely think that you could potentially do maybe your first 1 to 2 sets weighted, and then maybe you could do the rest of your sets unweighted. And the other tip I have for pull-ups is to use accessory work to build those muscle groups up. So we can use things like rows, pull downs, curls, things to build the forearms, biceps, and back muscles, which then over time, if we can increase the size of them, are probably going to transfer to improving our pull-up performance because they're the prime movers of the pull-up. So I don't have any special methods of improving pull-ups or body weight exercises. I just use it as a hypertrophy exercise and treat it pretty much the same as any other movement. Next question is when and where to program stuff like French contrasts. I see a lot of videos of people doing contrast but never know the context of when in the mesocycle it would be best to use. I work with combat sport athletes and have traditionally found it best to do more reps/sets earlier on and then towards the time of peak, drop the reps and sets but keep intensity high. Any insight would be greatly appreciated. Good question here, and I think he sort of was on the right track answering his own question. I think French contrast is best to use closer to when you need to peak, when the power work that you're going to do is going to be lightweight and the strength work you're going to do is heavy. So for contrast training, we're trying to take advantage of the potentiation effect from doing a heavy loaded exercise like a squat or deadlift, and then moving on to something that's unloaded or very lightly loaded, like a weighted jump or a medicine ball throw or something like that. So earlier in a training cycle, you're probably going to be using more higher volume, higher rep, higher set work like this guy mentioned. So the weight is probably not going to be as light. You're going to be doing slightly more of a hypertrophy emphasis. And the power work you're going to be doing is probably going to be more heavier loaded stuff, moving at slower velocities. So really there, we don't have that much of a contrast, and as well, the volume is going to be higher, so the potentiation effect is just going to be masked by fatigue. However, as you get closer to your peak, you're probably going to transition to more lighter loaded power work and then heavy lifting for the strength work, which means there's going to be a bigger contrast there and probably lower volume as well. So you can take more advantage there of the actual potentiation effect, which I think is where contrast training has the most benefit. Next question is it normal that at the end of mesocycle my performance decreases, in brackets less reps? Yes, I would say this is not an unusual thing to happen because by the end of the mesocycle you're going to be accumulating fatigue. So that fatigue accumulation is going to somewhat mask performance. And so by the end of a mesocycle, if you've accumulated a lot of fatigue, that may actually decrease your performance slightly by a few reps on each set, which is a pretty normal thing to happen. And it's not so much of an issue because then you're going to probably go into a deload after that final week of the mesocycle. However, if you're starting to see consistent decreases in performance midway through the mesocycle or even at the start of the mesocycle, you've probably started the mesocycle with far too much volume and you need to back that off in the next mesocycle. However, if performance is only dropping off a little bit towards the end of the mesocycle, that's fine, that's fairly common, and it shouldn't be an issue because once you deload, you'll drop all that accumulated fatigue, and then you can go back into regular training where your performance will be back to normal or even improved. Next question is, could you possibly explain the importance of eccentric strength in hammies and quads for sprinting, as I see a lot of people talking about it, but I don't fully understand its role? Great question here, and this is something I didn't understand as well in the first place, but now I think I have a decent grasp on it. So the eccentric strength required for the hammies and quads are actually two different things, but basically what we can understand is that when we're sprinting, we're not limited by concentric muscle actions like we are in a weight room, like doing traditional strength lifts. Every time we contact the ground, especially at top speed, there's an eccentric absorption of force before there is a propulsion of force. So the ground reaction forces that we can experience at top speed can be sort of above 5 times body weight on your single limb. So if we think about every single step is about 5 times body weight at top speed, we need to have some eccentric strength there to be able to actually absorb that force. Otherwise, we will just simply collapse into the ground. However, there's some more research coming out now that the muscle actions during sprinting are probably more isometric than actually eccentric. But nonetheless, it's sort of that isometric or eccentric muscle actions are definitely highly important for sprinting. That's more for the quads and calf muscles especially. For the hamstrings, it's slightly different. So the eccentric strength required for the hamstrings is slightly different because this is important when we're sprinting going through the late swing phase. So when that knee starts to open up before ground contact, there are huge eccentric forces on the hamstrings there, which is where we see the most hamstring tears. So if we can become eccentrically stronger, we can probably better handle those demands of sprinting during that late swing phase. So it's pretty important to do not only just pure concentric traditional strength training in the gym when we want to transfer to sprinting performance, but I think sort of stuff like plyometrics and heavy eccentric training is going to have more of an importance when we have to transfer it to sprinting or other athletic movements. Next question is If the goal is hypertrophy, is it okay for a beginner to do 3-day specific same exercises throughout until plateaued, or he should include weekly 3-day various changed exercises program until plateaued, which has more long-term benefits? So I didn't fully understand exactly what this meant, but I think what this person's trying to ask is that if someone's training 3 days per week, can they do the same exercises every single day of those 3 training sessions until they plateau? Or is it better to do different exercises on each day and then when they plateau, change them? So the short answer is I think it doesn't really matter too much. You can do the same exercise on each day or different exercises as long as the total amount of volume for each muscle group is equated over the week. The other option that you can do is you can do the same exercises each day, but change the rep range that you perform the exercises in. So for example, you might do bench press on all 3 days. On the first day, you might work in the 8 to 12 rep range. On the second day, you may work in the sort of 6 to 10 rep range. And on the third day, you may work in the 12 to 15 rep range. So that way you're doing the same exercise each time, but it's a slightly different stimulus because you're working in a different rep range. Otherwise, you can change the exercises on each day. That's fine. Just remember the total volume throughout the week is the most important variable. Next question is, what's the optimal mechanics for sprinting for a footballer who has longer legs? Should sport athletes sprint like track athletes? Good question. I actually made a video on this exact topic. Should all athletes actually try and run and replicate the sprinting technique of track athletes? And this is an interesting question because so clearly athletes playing other sports like field sports or court sports don't run exactly the same as track sprinters because they constantly need to accelerate, decelerate, change direction. There's people trying to tackle them. There's all sort of different stuff going on. So they don't just have to run in one straight line in the most efficient way. However, there are characteristics of track sprinters that are going to have positive effects on court and field sport athletes. So things like just general sprinting mechanics like accelerating with a positive shin angle, maintaining stiff ankle joints, things like that that can help any athletes, whatever their sport is. So in that regard, I think that yes, when you're training for sprinting as a field or team sport athlete, you should probably just try to generally replicate the sprinting techniques of track athletes. And then that can have probably positive transfer to the running techniques you're going to use in your sport when you're actually doing your sport practice and playing competitive matches. So I don't think there's really a difference if you have longer or short legs. I think you still want to sort of replicate that general sort of optimal running technique that track sprinters use and let those characteristics of that type of sprinting naturally transfer to your sport. Next question is it possible to train for muscle growth / strength and endurance at the same time and have gains in both? So the answer, yes, you can definitely have gains in both. However, there's going to be a trade-off when you train for both strength and hypertrophy and endurance at the same time. This is for 2 reasons. Number 1 is just the amount of resources you can allocate to each training quality. For example, if you do 2 endurance sessions per week, that is time and energy taken away where you could potentially be doing 2 strength and hypertrophy training sessions per week. So there's only a finite amount of actual energy and resources that we have to train throughout the entire week, and however you distribute that should be on what you want to prioritize. And the second reason is the interference effect. So if you train for strength and endurance simultaneously, there is some sort of crossover effect where the strength adaptations can be dulled slightly. However, if you're doing strength training and endurance training on different days, that interference effect is pretty much non-existent. It's only really if you're doing sort of strength training first and then endurance training almost immediately after that. So make sure when you're training for both endurance and strength / hypertrophy, you're separating them on different days. And you want to make sure you're allocating the time and energy to the qualities that you want to prioritize most. Next question here is more on agility training, in brackets, all aspects, change of direction, reaction, eccentric strength, how to periodize, develop with speed training or not, muscle groups to strengthen. Good question here, and I'll just generally talk about my views on agility training and some tips to help you improve agility. So first and foremost, agility refers to the ability to change direction in reaction to a stimulus. So there's 2 parts to that. There's the cognitive part, which is the reaction, and then there's the change of direction, which is the physical part. So how fast you can actually change direction is going to be down to things like your technique, your change of direction mechanics, your eccentric strength, your linear speed, etc. And the second part to that is the cognitive part, which is going to be improved by reacting to a specific stimulus to your sport. So there's no point doing agility training with a non-specific stimulus, because that's not going to make you better at reacting to a completely different stimulus. For example, if you play a field or team sport, you want to be able to react to the gameplay and what other people are doing on the field, not reacting to someone pointing or blowing a whistle or telling you which color cone to run to. So I think the cognitive side of things should be almost purely trained just during sport practice, because this is going to be the most specific stimulus, and it's actually the only thing that's really going to make you better at reacting to that stimulus. The physical side of things, I think, are going to be mainly trained during sport practice, because you're doing hundreds of changes of direction every single week, playing your sport during practice and competitive games. And then maybe some additional low volume change of direction work can be done outside of sport practice and competition, just to sort of work on those mechanics. However, pretty much 95% of your change of direction work is going to be done during sport practice, and you're not even going to realize you're doing it. I think you're better off spending your time developing more general qualities like linear speed, acceleration, doing plyometric training, power training, strength training, and then that'll naturally transfer to the change of direction work that you're going to be doing during sport practice and competition anyway. So I don't think there is necessarily things to do specifically for change of direction work. I think there's general physical training qualities that you're going to be doing, which you're probably doing anyway, then just let that naturally transfer to all the change of direction work you're doing already. And the last question is, working twice per week with a basketball player, would you do maximum strength in both days, or just one day and the other like speed and power? It's enough to work maximum once a week. Great videos, keep the awesome work. So good question here, and I think this sort of follows on from the previous question. I think if you only have 2 days to do strength and conditioning work, I would say to do both of them, strength and hypertrophy work in the gym, and then let your sport practice take care of the running and change of direction work, because you're going to be doing all of that stuff anyway during sport practice. So if you only have 2 sessions to do, I would just allocate that time to just general gym work, and then you're doing more of those athletic movements already during sport practice. And if you can, before your sport practice sessions, you can probably do some low volume linear speed work and potentially some plyometric work, just to get a little bit of that in before your sport practice, so you actually make sure you're exposing yourself to some of those qualities. If not, I think training maximum strength once per week can be okay in the short term, but I think over an entire season, you're probably not going to see much improvements just doing 1 session of max strength work per week. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.